Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. I'm your host, Hannah Zuberi, and you're watching us on Muslim Network TV. You can watch Muslim Network TV 24/7 on Galaxy 19 satellite, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. Today, I wanted to talk about U.S. military aid to Israel. As we head into the election cycle, and many of our elected officials, the people who are running for power, running for elected office, this is a pledge that they make often to another country, not the United people of the United States, but to people overseas. The US's unwavering support of Israel in its joint military ventures comes with a tremendous cost. Billions have been spent over the years to help provide Israel with a strong defense program and other strategic needs. The US provides more military aid to Israel than to any other state. Over the years, let's say since its founding in 1946, United States has spent over uh, $38 billion in aid, and this is an older number. These research that I'm quoting is old, and this is why today we're going to have a guest who's going to update us on that research, update us on what it costs to U.S. taxpayers to send aid to Israel. On September 14, 2016, the Obama administration signed an agreement to increase foreign military aid financing to Israel by 27%. Yet, and we know that the U.S. Already gives more military aid to Israel more than all other countries combined. So from 2019, U.S. taxpayers have been giving an additional $3.8 billion per year to Israel. What can that buy us? What can that do for children here in the United States? Healthcare in the United States, education in the United States. So to discuss this and much more, and particularly look at the aid given to Israel under and look at it under U.S. law itself. I wanted to invite to the show our guest, Zarifa. Zarifa is a researcher, and she's a master. She just graduated with a master's degree from the University of Washington, and I am really grateful for her to be here. I've been hearing a lot about her research, and I wanted her to share with us because this is a look at this aid that I don't think has been investigated. We've heard a lot in the past, even on this show, about Palestine and U.S. ties with Israel, but this is an aspect that we have not explored before. So thank you so much for being here today.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm so honored to be on this show. This is really exciting.
Alhamdulillah. So tell us a little bit more about yourself. Tell us more about your advocacy, your research, but I wanted to learn a little bit more about you yourself.
Sure. So my name is Zarifa Baroud. I am 21 years old. I just graduated with my master's degree in foreign policy. I work for American Muslims for Palestine. I do their digital content along with another coworker of mine. So I've been working with them for about a year now. And they kind of introduced me to advocacy and to lobbying and to these topics that we will talk about today that I ended up diving deeper into and focusing my master's thesis on.
Okay, alhamdulillah. So, when we look at discussions, as when you're sitting here watching the Democratic National Convention or the Republican National Convention, because as we can see, both conventions are pretty solid on their standing towards Israel and towards defending Israel. So it's not a difference. This is something that both parties agree on. And you see many of our local politicians pledged support. And while we look at how here in the United States children are suffering, there are a lot of people in the US do not have health care. More than 1.6 million children don't have health care. And the amount of money that is spent and given to Israel could definitely increase our healthcare budget. It could help housing here in the United States. It could help education here in the United States. So let's start off with that. As you're looking, how much has the aid increased? What have the trends been? If you could start off with that.
So aid in Israel to Israel began initially in 1998, or sorry, 1947. What am I saying? In 1947, a year before Israel was actually established.
Mm-hmm.
So we started providing money in 1947 to the Zionist movement and the military that supported them, the Haganah, which would turn into the Israeli Defense Forces in 1948. Since then, aid has exponentially increased every year, no matter how progressive the administration is. And in 2008, interestingly enough, you say that money could go to funding hospitals and schools and social services in the United States that are greatly needed and have been greatly needed. But since 2008, that aid hasn't been going to support Israeli hospitals or schools either. Since 2008, it's been purely military funding. Any economic aid that had been given to Israel prior to that was just funneled right into military aid. So they weren't getting less money, but the military was getting more money.
What are these, if you don't mind going into a little bit of this, what is it used for?
Okay, so every 10 years, since 1998, every 10 years, there are 10-year agreements called Memorandums of Understanding. Mm-hmm. And these deals are renewed every year. However, the deal itself lasts for 10 years. And so basically in each understanding, the US has pledged to Israel, most recently, $38 billion. Mm-hmm. And that money is separated into two categories. The first one is $33 billion of foreign military financing. And foreign military financing does not require the recipient country or state to track anything. And so we don't actually know for sure where the money is going. Only on certain intelligence committees in Congress. They're the only ones that have any access to this. It's highly classified. Mm-hmm. But yeah, in an article written by Frida Berrigan, who is a scholar but also a member of the Green Party, she said that because of the proportion of aid and military equipment that Israel receives during every offensive or moment of combat, they are using American weapons and American technology. So during every single time. The remaining $5 billion of that $38 billion goes to missile defense appropriations, which I believe is easier to track, but still a lot of this information is very highly classified. Even government agencies, there's no mechanism for them to be able to track any of this. Even if they send in a request, there's not even a mechanism for them to be able to do that.
This is okay. So even if I went up to my congressperson and I asked them, unless they're on that defense committee, they would not be able to find out where U.S. tax dollars are going and how they're being spent.
Exactly.
That is mind-blowing. I mean, this is something
that's a massive amount of money.
Exactly. $38 billion. It's like a blank check given and use it how you will and for whatever, so unless only and so a lot of times we hear this trope is that a lot of that money is just coming right back to the US because they're buying those military equipment from the United States. So what do you know about that?
The U.S. is the largest arms exporter to Israel out of any other country. However, Israel does have special perks
Mhm.
um, with the US providing them aid. For example, Israel is the only country in the world that receives aid from the US that's allowed to use that aid to develop their own military industry.
Mm.
And so they're developing weaponry by themselves, and that's why they're the largest arms exporter in the Middle East. But a lot of that, of course, is coming from the United States. A lot of that actual the bullets, the guns, the rocket launchers, the missiles, a lot of that is coming directly from American-made companies.
So trying to wrap my head around this because the number is so large, and the fact that we don't know where it's being spent, that's not public knowledge. We don't, and the fact that now, and we know this because we've seen this in our work on India, that India is now buying weapons directly from Israel. UAE is buying, a lot of these other, Saudi Arabia, a lot of these places that were traditionally, you would never think of them as buyers of weapons from Israel, are now purchasing weapons from Israel. No, not only that, we know that in the Rohingya genocide, that's one of the things that we work on, is that that Israeli made warcraft, especially warcraft, was used against the Rohingya people,
Mhm.
and Israel supplies this to Burma, and so it's a really vast web uh,
Mhm.
that they have spun around the world. So, but you were saying, let's continue. So that was one of the things that you know, that there has been increase in the amount of aid from previous years and the memorandum of understandings. So what is in this latest memorandum of understanding?
Well, the latest one was in 2016 under Obama, I believe, and that pledged $38 billion. Um, Yeah, basically, it was just a renewal of the old plan. Nothing really changed in terms of the technicalities of the deal, I believe, other than that drastic increase of aid.
So, and in your research, you have been also looking at um, specifically a certain law that applies to aid that is given to other states. Can you share a little bit about, let's dig a little bit into that. What is the law? What is the name of the law? What happens? What is it? How does it affect aid that is given?
Okay, so the Leahy Laws was established in 1997 by a senator in Vermont. And basically, what the law says, it's an amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act, which states that the U.S. is prohibited from providing any military financing to any military or police unit
Mhm.
that has been suspected of committing gross human rights violations. And in the FAA, in the Foreign Assistance Act, they define what a human rights violation is.
Mhm.
And that's basically the backbone of my research. I use the definition and I say Israel has fulfilled every segment of this definition in these different cases. The definition is cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment or punishment, um, and things of that sort, like also detention without trial and proper legal representation is a large segment of the definition. And so then that will feed into how Israel runs its prison system, for example.
So let's break that up. I know there were four segments that you analyzed them under. So how have you made that connection? What are some of the examples for those of you who might not be who might be watching and not be familiar with the Palestinian oppression? If you could share with us what exactly, how is it being used under each one of those, if we're going to be talking about detentions, let's talk about detentions first.
Okay, so the segment of the definition that I used to speak about detentions was prolonged detention without charges and trial,
Mhm.
and also causing the disappearance of persons by the abduction and clandestine detention of those persons. And so I talk both about the detention of minors, and I talk about also the case of Mohammed Halabi,
Mhm.
which is who was an international charity worker that was detained by Israel and has been imprisoned by Israel ever since, under false charges that have been condemned by the Australian government, where the organization originated. So I talk about cases like this. Um, if we want to talk about the IPS, which is the Israeli prison system, um, surely a great deal of aid is provided to them because of how large and important the prison system is to Israel and uh, to stopping any type of resistance. For example, the leading conviction of minors in the West Bank um, is stone throwing.
Mhm. Stone throwing.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
So throwing a rock at a tank, throwing a rock at a border, throwing a rock at a soldier. Um, and oftentimes, maybe they didn't even do that, but they don't have to inform. Israel isn't required to inform children or any detainee why they're being detained. Um, I think there was a statistic that said that over 60% of children weren't told why they were arrested. And of course, their parents wouldn't know that either. Um, okay, so I have some statistics available for the way that children are treated in Israeli prisons. So basically, when a child gets arrested for something like stone throwing,
Mhm.
oftentimes the tactic used by the Israeli military is to come to their home early in the morning before the sun has risen, um, and pull them out of bed and then blindfold them, handcuff them, and throw them into a military vehicle. Um, let's see. Yeah, according to Defense for Children International Palestine, they found in a study that 93.2% of all children were bounded um, in stressed positions. 72% were blindfolded. And this is something really important. 66% of minors were transferred to prisons inside of Israel. If you know anything about the occupation of the West Bank and both Gaza, is that Palestinians, it is not easy for them to get into Israel by any means. So this is a direct violation of the Geneva Convention, not only the transfer of an occupied person to the territory of the occupier,
Mhm.
but the denying them the right to legal representation or to their parent. So a great deal of minors are the majority of them are left with no parents. A lot of them, in one study, over 90% of them said, I didn't get a family visit one time because my parents weren't able to get proper um, the proper permits to enter Israel in the first place. It takes maybe 1 to 3 months, according to one study, for any Palestinian in the West Bank to be able to enter Israel. And of course, in Gaza, that is a lot more harsh for security purposes, of course. Um,
Mhm.
so that lack of legal representation, that lack of uh, advice from your family and support from your family uh, causes that conviction rate to rise,
Yeah.
regardless if they're innocent or not. So the conviction rate for Palestinian minors in Israeli prisons is 99.74%.
Oh my God.
So almost 100% of minors are convicted regardless.
And they're picked up for stone throwing. That is. So tell us what those numbers are. So when we say 99.7%, how many children is that?
Um, in recent years, I think it's a study by Defense for Children International Palestine
Mhm.
found that I think it's over 7,000 children are arrested every year.
7,000 children arrested every year. And how are they let go? Are they, I mean, obviously you just quoted that 99.7% are incarcerated because they lose their cases. They don't have any connection or contact with their family members. So what happens to them after that?
After that, the the time that they spend in detention or arbitrary detention, or if they're imprisoned, varies depending on their age and the conviction. I've seen cases that have lasted they spend 2 months in prison. I've seen cases that have lasted over a year, for minors, for cases such as these. And something else about them being security prisoners, that so if they commit a security offense, they're labeled as a security prisoner within the prison. And so if you have a 7-year-old that was playing with his friends and threw a tank or threw a rock at a tank, for example, which is something common in Palestine, it's a very popular act of resistance. And then they were arrested because they're a security prisoner. During their interrogations, they have no right to have their interrogations filmed or recorded.
Mm.
So technically in 1999, torture was made illegal in Israel. But then after that was passed, the the Israeli Attorney General said, if any of you interrogators get in trouble for using special means, I will protect you. And
Mm.
so that is why it's over 70%, 74.5% of minors are physically abused during interrogations,
Mm.
and over 60% of them are verbally abused. And verbal abuse, of course, is oftentimes intimidation, humiliation. In a lot of testimonies that I read, it was them threatening to arrest other family members. Like, if you don't confess, I'm going to arrest your mom. You know what I mean?
Well, you
So
tell a 12-year-old boy that whose
it's
mom is
like, okay, I confess, right? So, yeah, and also 96.9% of them had no lawyer or family during interrogation. So that's really scary. Over 60% of them were wrote a written confession on a paper that was written in Hebrew, something that they didn't understand.
Yeah.
So that, of course, contributes to that large number of almost 100% of them are convicted.
So, what other human rights violations did you research into?
I focused on the case of Operation Protective Edge, which happened in 2014.
Mhm.
It was one of the bloodier wars committed against Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces. I want to have the proper statistics in front of me. Let's see. Okay, so and during that duration, I think it was between July 6th to August 27th. The IDF killed 2,191 people.
Mm.
So 2,191, and then 66 soldiers were killed, and 4 civilians in Israel. 1,660 of those killed in Palestine were civilians. 527 of them were children, and 299 of them were women. The UN estimated that over 370,000 children in Gaza require immediate psychosocial support. And obviously, we know that that is not being provided by the United States after, of course, Trump cut UNRWA funding significantly. Also, during this war, 11,100 people were wounded, including over 3,000 children. And I think that it's not misleading to say that they were just wounded, because a lot of these times, because of the lack of available healthcare, the lack of running hospitals in Gaza, a lot of the time a simple wound could require amputation. I personally I've had family, I've had friends back home, people that have come to the United States because they've had an amputation and they need proper medical care that Gaza isn't able to provide. Yeah, and almost 450 elderly people were also wounded. So obviously that could lead directly to death for people like that.
You know what? And so now I wanted to know how this law is implemented. When you look at the State Department papers, they're clear about that when there's an entire unit which is designated to receive assistance, the Department of State vets the unit and the unit commander. When an individual security force member is nominated for U.S. assistance, the department vets that individual as well as his or her unit. Vetting
Mhm.
begins in the unit's home country, where the U.S. Embassy conducts consular, political, and other security and human rights checks. Most often, an additional review is conducted by an analyst at the Department of State. Um, yeah, and then the State Department evaluates and assesses available information about human rights records of the unit and the individual, reviewing a full spectrum of open source and classified records.
Yeah, so any time that the State Department vets a country for aid, it's a supposedly a thorough 8-step process.
Mhm.
But a study conducted in 2011 through 2015 found that out of all of the units that were vetted, only 0.3% of them were rejected aid. Um, and I think that we know if we turn on the news, we can tell that there's more than 0.3% of countries that are committing human rights violations in this world right now. Another study in 2010 to 2013 um, collected the results of 530,000 military units that were vetted, and of those, only over a little bit over 2,000 were denied aid. So this vetting process is not so efficient. I mean, in regards to human rights standards.
And so this is something that we want to push, and we anybody watching, this is something that as a human rights organization, I do this show on the TV channel, but the show is in the context of human rights. It's on peace and justice, and we push our audience to actually go out and make sure that the people who are running for office have a human rights platform as well. what
Mhm.
what is their human rights platform? What do they stand for? And each one of these presidential candidates that we've been pushing them on human rights concerns, but particularly let's look at President Biden. One of the things that we push for is that whenever that he needs to include in its human rights platform, that whenever he is in negotiations or trade talks with any of these countries, or a military aid, that a human rights expert, that is from the impacted community or related, has expertise in the impacted community, has to be a part of those negotiations. That's where, I mean, we really need to push this agenda, because the lobbyists for these multi-billion-dollar military companies, they own some of these, and so the regular people who want some of that money to stay here in the United States to take care of the people here, need to get involved in this. So what else have you found out about this law, and how it's not being implemented, and what can people do about this?
So from my research, I only found one time in which aid was even considered to be rejected to Israel, to any of its units. In 2006, when Israel invaded Lebanon,
Mhm.
they were using cluster munitions in civilian areas. Um, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International all had people on the ground saying all of the cluster bombs we're seeing are American made. Um,
Mhm.
and at the time, President Reagan, he said, we'll hold an investigation, uh, but Congress didn't embrace the investigation whatsoever, so it was dropped, and we um, continued providing them with cluster bombs till today. Um, so a lot of these controversial munitions are still being provided to Israel, even though in the past there have been so-called investigations. Um, in regards to the Leahy laws, though, all of the investigations are technically confidential.
Mhm.
Um, I can only assume that with being a member of the public, not having access to these records, not being on these intelligence committees, that because aid has increased, there hasn't been a successful investigation,
Mm.
whether that's classified or declassified. So, yeah.
And this is so has can so I'm just like some of the when you find out these things, just like as in the case of BDS, as in the case of this law that you just talked about, right? Like a lot of people will not even know that this law exists. Number one, people who are concerned, and number two, that it's not being followed upon, uh,
Mhm.
and that even those organizations that are anti-war or even some of this might not even be in their realm of on their radar. And that's why I'm a little bit taken back that this is like the first time that I've heard about this. And so can you tell us if anybody has done any investigations? Have articles been published on this? Has there been any, and it doesn't even need to be on Palestine, could about what about other countries that are committing these gross human rights violations? Has anybody done any investigative work on this?
Well, human rights agencies such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Defense for Children International have done amazing work, and they have thousands of testimonies and thousands of statistics that could be used when implementing these laws. It's actually written in the Leahy laws that it's highly suggested that we use information from these agencies when working on investigations. But because foreign military financing is so difficult to track, even if Congress wanted to hold an investigation, they don't have any proof. So, of where exactly this is going, what units is going to. So it makes the prospect of accountability really small. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
So I understand that yes, the work of human rights organizations such as Amnesty and HRW, as well as others, can be used. But my question is, has it been used? Are there people who are actively working on dismantling military aid, using the force of this law?
This law has been successful in withholding aid to only a handful of countries.
Mm,
So units in Honduras and Guatemala, Nigeria, but soon after, like months after aid had been restricted, it was renewed again to those countries. I think it was Human Rights Watch that said the US will outwardly and like unapologetically break the law if it um, if it if it fits their agenda.
mhm.
And obviously, a lot of these countries that I listed do have America wants dominance in those places, and that's why Israel is so important to them geographically. Um, yeah.
Wow. And this is, I mean, like if you read up on the works of, I believe Amnesty sort of broke down the Leahy law and how it whether it solves the problem of human rights problem, as in the context of foreign military and police units. One of the things that they point out that this is the law. It's not a policy guideline. It is in
Not a recommendation.
exactly. And so the other thing that they say is, for example, the vetting process itself. The U.S. government currently utilizes Google keyword searches as a first step in its online investigation. And for those who aren't familiar with this type of search, it doesn't pick up information in PDF. So a tip for fellow human rights organizations is to make sure that their reports are also available in HTML and text format. So this is something that all Palestinian rights, Rohingya rights organizations, Uyghur rights organizations, as well as others, which maybe recipients of U.S. aid should be doing, is to making sure that their reports, and this is very true, like a lot of times these PDFs are floating around, but Google searches don't pick them up. And
Mhm.
and the fact is that the State Department has let go of so much staff. So additional staff is needed just for this vetting process.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you have seen any addition of more staff at the State Department for this, or this should be something that should be pushed, as a new administration will be coming in after the November elections. What were some of the other things in your research that's really surprised you?
I think that something that really caught me off guard was when I read the 2019 Human Rights Report from the US government on Israel. Um, After having done all this research, that was kind of my conclusion. I kind of read that at the very end. Um, and something that stuck out to me the most was when they were talking about prisons and laws against torture in Israel. They talked about uh, conditions for prisoners in Israeli prisons. Um, in particular, they made an excuse for Israel, saying that special means are only allowed in ticking time bomb situations or in situations involving security prisoners, which if anyone had heard what I said before, the majority of all prisoners, adult and minors, are all security prisoners. So I feel like there is an element of trickery on the part of the US government, um, to just conveniently leave out that special means and things like this are legal towards the majority of Palestinian prisoners.
Mm.
That's something that really upset me. Um, but it's hard because we can't it's hard to have, like, high expectations of the US government when it comes to human rights standards. We know that through even things going on right now, um, that the US government itself has such a lack of regard
Mhm.
towards human life, let alone human rights. Um, so asking them to implement this to one of the largest ally in that region seems seems difficult. I think the US has a lot of issues it needs to work out before it can start holding other people accountable, but this is definitely one of the primary ones, given that we're the largest arms exporter, we're the largest patron of aid to Israel, in the whole world, and directly enabling and, assisting these human rights violations and war crimes.
And I think that at times like this, especially during a pandemic, especially during a time where governments need to reanalyze where money is being spent, how, what, what we really stand for. Like, I know for under this administration, we've left the WHO, we've left the UN Human Rights Council. Um, uh, this pullback on, as leaders of human rights anywhere in the world, that even if there was a facade previously that the United States was a leader on human rights, now that facade is like sort of definitely been lifted. So this is something that is concerning to anybody who's working on these issues. How would you suggest people who are concerned about the Palestinian rights, who are concerned about military spending, who are concerned about the US budget and how it's spent, can use your research? Where can they find it, and how can they use it?
It will soon be available, for everyone to read on the University of Washington Library Archive. I can provide you that link later on. It hasn't fully processed yet, but it will be there soon. And then inshallah in the future I can get it published in a journal. But in the meantime, a lot of this information can be found um, on the Congressional Research Service website. A lot of this information can be found again in the Human Rights Agency websites that I talked about as well. In regards to advocating, I think I don't know if I mentioned that I work for American Muslims for Palestine, but we're currently supporting legislation that that calls for a discontinuation of aid to certain Israeli military units, particularly those who are working to actualize annexation in the West Bank. Um, so if you go to the American Muslims for Palestine website, you'll be able to find a Take Action section.
Mhm.
And there you can find a really nice web page where you can quickly just write in your name and your zip code, and it will directly send an email to your member of Congress saying you need to support this act. We need to cut aid to Israel and all units that have been suspected of committing human rights violations. It's a really powerful piece of legislation by Betty McCollum from Minnesota, and it's really easy to do. There's really easy steps you can take, and then there's more kind of in-depth steps that you can take, such as supporting the BDS movement and making sure that you're not supporting or even working for companies that support the Israeli military, such as Boeing, which I know that a lot of people in our community work for organizations like this, but it's something that definitely needs to be reevaluated.
Okay. And this is something, and obviously, you guys are hosting advocacy days coming up in September, right? September 15th, I believe it is. And we had Mohammed talk about that earlier. And that is something that we're pushing people to attend if they're serious about Palestinian advocacy, or they're even just serious about $38 billion of their hard earned income being spent on killing and maiming children and arresting 7,000 kids a year. This is something that a lot of times when we look at, you do a quick Google search of what the aid is being used for, and you see the amount of bombs and the amount of like really, really like, you know, defense, and they call it defense, but it's what are you defending yourselves against? Do you need these missiles to defend yourselves
Even in Operation Protective Edge, I mean, over 2,000 people killed, the majority of which were civilians, and only, what was it that I said? How many Israeli soldiers were killed?
66? I remember that.
6.
66. So you spent,
How is that self-defense?
I don't know. It surprises me, but then for sometimes I'm like, okay, maybe it's should, we see this every day, so we get surprised, or we should, we're looking at it through a lens. Like, I'm just trying to think of an average Joe American who perhaps has nothing to do with foreign policy, doesn't care, doesn't. Basically they're concerned about what is happening in their kids' schools. They might not have a laptop to go to school and attend classes, because their school district can't afford to give Chromebooks to every kid. But imagine your tax money that is being spent in this manner. And this is something that we should all be concerned about. Yeah, and as you said, if that was being used for hospitals in Israel, or in the occupied territories, if it was being spent on providing education or building making a better life for somebody, maybe someone could have like some excuse, right? But at this it's being spent to kill people. It's being spent to kill and incarcerate little kids.
It's being spent for the Israeli military to demolish Palestinian hospitals,
Mhm.
Palestinian COVID testing centers in East Jerusalem. During Operation Protective Edge, multiple hospitals and UN schools, the UN schools that my dad went to, were bombed.
Mm.
So it's it's complete corruption. It's complete brutality. And I think that they learned well from the US. So it's hard. It's a tricky situation. Obviously, that's kind of something that I had to grasp with at the conclusion of my thesis was, I don't know what to do. Like I don't know what the US is expected to do. I don't expect them to, unless there are actual progressives, actual radical progressives in Congress, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that
Mhm.
immediately she wasn't scared to say what she said right after being voted in. She was immediately on top of legislation, trying to trying to hold arms embargoes against Israel. Um, so I think that if we have more people like that, putting pressure on our president, whoever that president may be, is incredibly important. So again, what you were saying about what can the average Joe do, I think elect progressive people into Congress, and into the Senate. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have such a satisfying conclusion.
I know, no, and this is no. Thank you so much because this, and you know what I'm really pleased with is that now American kids like you all are using their education to actually work in the field in a manner that is productive. So it's not coming out of a place of emotion, it's coming out of a place of research, statistics, really backed up. Like it's not something that people look. That's because a lot of times, even when you're in these meetings, that is what I often feel like when you're in congressional meetings, that when you speak from an emotional point of view, yes, there might be a moment of connection. Oh, that, I'm worried about, I'm an American citizen. I'm worried about my family over there. But beyond that, when people are looking at American laws being broken now,
Mhm.
now people are looking at, yes, hey, 38 billion dollars. How could I have used that, a part of that money, for my own district, right? um, how many problems could I solve in my own district if that part of that funding was not going here, but was going towards other federal government expenditure? So that is something that I feel like this is really like, I'm really super pleased about that, and I'm glad that you're going to be using your research for advocacy purposes and for people to be able to now make concrete, it's sad, but that's the real reality of the world we live in. We wish people would be moved by the fact that all these lives are being killed or destroyed, incarcerated. That a hospital that people have invested in is being destroyed, but that's not how a lot of times these offices work. That's not how, at times, a lot of how decisions are made. So the fact that now these causes, such as the Palestinian cause, has actual research being done. And so when did the Leahy law come into your radar? Like, how did you find out about it, and how did you decide to do research on it?
So I think it was a couple years ago, Betty McCollum came out with a bill in support of Palestinian minors in Israeli detention. And she used the Leahy laws as an argument to end the funding of Israeli prisons and the system that enables children to be arrested in the manner that they are. So that's how I first heard of the Leahy laws, and then I read more into it and realized that it's so much more far-reaching than simply prisoners, but it's every aspect of Israel is violating the Leahy laws. So, yeah.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Zarifa, for being here and for sharing your research. We look forward to it being published. And so we would love to see maybe an infographic or something come out from AMP that we can help amplify, because this is absolutely, like, a lot of times information is broad and people need to be able to, see it in sometimes a bite-sized clip. So I look forward to that. As for the rest of us, we have an action out right now on Save India from Fascism. Please call your congresspeople, and the deadline for India being designated as a country of particular concern is coming up really soon, and we need as much pressure as possible on the State Department and on our Congress and Senate to declare India a country of particular concern. So please go to Justice for All now, where we have tweets ready for you. Click and tweet. You can tweet at your congressperson. We have a calling tool set up for you to be able to call your congresspeople and let them know your concern and what you believe should be, how your concern for minorities in India. And it's the more research we do on this, the more we see Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, Dalits, all sorts of minorities being persecuted in India. And a lot of the world is unaware and does not know anything about what is happening. So we really hope that you guys can participate. If you want to sign up for meetings, if you haven't had a meeting with your congressperson on Indian minorities and your concern for them, please sign up for advocacy days, and we will help you arrange a meeting for you. So thank you so much for being here, for being a part of Justice for All. We cannot do this work without you. We cannot. We're grateful to the Muslim Network TV for hosting this show for us. Please watch Muslim Network TV 24/7 on Galaxy 19, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV. And again, the website is www.justiceforall.org, and you can find the actions on the front page. We also have Save Advocacy Days going on, Save Uyghur Advocacy Days going on with the Uyghur American Association. They're leading this project and we're assisting them. So please join us. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.